Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're doing something a bit different. Think of it as an archaeological dig, but instead of soil, we're sifting through words. Old words.
That's a great way to put it. We're digging into this huge pile of historical records, this vast colonial archive, and we're trying to uncover the hidden logic, the thing that actually helped build the modern world as we know it.
Right. And our main source today is this really fascinating study. It's called Across Colonial Travel Narratives, 1879-1922, a general world theory approach. Quite a mouthful, but really important stuff.
It is. They looked at, get this, over 3,200 pages of travel writing, journals, reports, missionary accounts, you name it, all from that peak period of empire, roughly 1879 to 1922, and covering 5 continents: Americas, Arabia, Asia, Australasia, Africa. It's massive.
And the core idea, the thing you really need to grasp to follow our conversation, is that these writings weren't just passive observations. They weren't just diaries saying, I went here, I saw this.
No, not at all. The study argues they were active sites of world-making. That's the key phrase.
World-making, meaning what exactly? How does writing make a world?
It means the way these travelers described things. The land, the people, the economy, what they thought a place could be. That description actively shaped the reality. It created the justifications for hierarchies, for exploitation, for the whole imperial system.
So the words themselves built the framework. Description was creation, in a very real sense.
You got it. And to tackle this huge, ethically sticky amount of material, the researchers needed a really robust lens, a way to make sense of it all.
Which is where general world theory comes in. GWT.
Exactly, GWT. Think of it as a meta-framework, a sort of philosophy guiding how you look at things. Its main point is that you just cannot separate the different bits of reality.
Okay, like what bits?
Like the material world, the land, resources, buildings, railroads. You can't separate that from the epistemic world, how we know things, what counts as truth, whose knowledge matters. And you can't separate that from the ethical world, how we justify our actions, what's right and wrong.
So it's all tangled together, stuff, ideas, and morals.
Precisely. GWT says it's all interconnected, co-arising even.
So our plan for this deep dive is to use GWT as our map. We're going to walk through its 9 core dimensions, these sort of relational concepts, to see how that global imagination was actually built and argued over during that key period.
And hopefully show how that blueprint laid down over a century ago still kind of shapes the global system we're living in right now. It's not just history, it's our foundation.
Okay, let's dive into part 1. We'll start with GWT's dimensions that focus on relational systems, basically, how things connect and interact. The first one is interdependence.
Right. The core idea here is pretty straightforward. Everything's connected. All systems, all truths, they influence each other, they emerge together. Nothing just exists in a vacuum.
And the travel narratives, according to the study, show this interdependence in a really, stark and often brutal way, especially between nature and society.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't just linked. The study calls them co-constitutive asymmetrical systems. Fancy term, but it means they created each other. But the relationship was deeply unequal. One often thrived by crushing the other.
Where does this come through most clearly? You mentioned stark examples.
We really have to look at Java, under the Dutch East Indies administration. Specifically, something called the Dutch culture system.
The culture system sounds neutral, but I suspect it wasn't.
Far from it. It was basically a state-enforced system where Javanese farmers had to use a big chunk of their land, sometimes up to 2/3, and their labor, to grow export crops for the Dutch market. Think coffee, sugar, indigo.
Instead of growing food for themselves, like rice, which was the staple.
Exactly. It displaced local food production on a massive scale. And the result, as documented even by contemporary travelers, it was catastrophic.
How bad was it?
It led directly to mass famine. The study cites figures indicating the death of 500,000 native Javanese people, just from starvation caused by this system. It was state-created scarcity.
500,000 people. That's staggering. But you mentioned asymmetry, the GWT twist. How does that play out here?
Well, here's the deeply disturbing paradox. At the same time this horrific famine was happening, travelers were describing Java as incredibly fertile, a Garden of Eden, lush, abundant vegetation. This system, built on forced labor and starvation, was generating immense wealth for Holland.
Wait, so mass death and apparent ecological richness, side by side, caused by the same system. How on earth did the colonial narrative square that circle ethically?
That's where the world-making comes in. The justification was a masterclass in imperial mental gymnastics. They pointed to the wealth, the productive landscape, and argued that, well, out of evil has come good.
Seriously, they acknowledged the evil.
They acknowledged the suffering, yes, but framed it as a necessary evil, a painful but unavoidable step on the road to progress, defined, of course, as Dutch profit and a landscape transformed for export. The outcome justified the horrific means. That rationalization is the world-making.
It's chilling. The land's productivity excuses the human cost, and the human cost is justified because the land becomes productive for them. We see similar dynamics you mentioned in Yucatan, Mexico, linking environment and control.
Yes, Yucatan is another powerful case study in interdependence. The geography there is key. The region basically has no surface rivers, the main freshwater source. These underground caves and sinkholes called cenotes.
Okay, cenotes. And where were they located?
Crucially, they were almost always located on the large estates, the haciendas that produced henequen or sisal hemp, a valuable fiber crop.
So control the cenote.
And you control the water. And if you control the water in a region with no rivers, you control the population. The natural scarcity was weaponized. It became the physical log enforcing Mayan serfdom. The hacienda owners controlled the only reliable water. This meant the Mayan laborers, who were essentially serfs, couldn't just run off into the jungle. They wouldn't survive long without access to the hacienda cenote. So a natural feature became the tool for maintaining a brutal social hierarchy. Geography and social structure completely intertwined.
Wow. And this wasn't just local, right? The study stresses that this interdependence stretched across the globe, especially with things like health and technology.
Definitely. Disease outbreaks became one of the first truly global vulnerabilities, and it was tied directly to the new infrastructure of empire. Take the port city of Jeddah.
Key point for the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca and a major trade hub.
Exactly. And it was repeatedly tagged in these narratives as a focus of infection, particularly for cholera.
But the travelers understood it wasn't just about local sanitation issues.
They began to grasp that, yes. The cholera epidemics weren't just because of conditions in Jeddah itself, but because Jeddah was a critical node in global networks. Pilgrims and traders traveling through Jeddah picked up the bacteria and carried it onward, spreading cholera along the new, faster steamship routes into the Mediterranean and then into Europe.
So an early grim lesson in global epidemiology: local health is tied to global movement.
And here's the real kicker, the irony the study points out. The very symbols of progress, the steamships, the railways, lauded for shrinking the world and boosting efficiency, they were identified by the travelers themselves as the key agents spreading the choleric element.
So the technology meant to conquer distance actually made the world more vulnerable faster?
Precisely. Progress inadvertently weaponized disease. What might have been a localized outbreak could now become a potential pandemic threat across continents in weeks, not months or years. It's a dynamic we're still dealing with today, obviously, with air travel and viruses. That interdependence has only deepened.
And the last piece here is economic synchronization. You mentioned the Mayan serfdom in Yucatan. How did global events affect that local system?
Well, the demand for Yucatan's henequen, the sisal hemp produced by that forced labor, absolutely boomed at one point. Why? Because the Spanish-American War, happening thousands of miles away, destroyed the competing Manila hemp plantations in the Philippines.
So a war in Asia wiped out the competition.
Driving up demand and prices for Yucatan's hemp, which in turn made the system of Mayan exploitation even more profitable and entrenched. A direct line from a geopolitical conflict in the Pacific to the reinforcement of serfdom in Mexico.
Incredible. So GWT's lens of interdependence shows us the famine in Java, the water control in Yucatan, the cholera spread. They weren't isolated events. They were symptoms of a single, interconnected, deeply unequal global system taking shape.
#tag2.
Pluralism, multiple truths and systems. Okay, moving on to the second GWT dimension, pluralism. This one's about acknowledging that reality is complex. There's no single worldview, no single method, no one system of knowledge that can possibly capture everything. The world is just too rich, too diverse for that.
So if reality is plural, then these travel narratives must be full of, well, clashes between different ways of knowing, different truths bumping up against each other.
Exactly. The colonial archive becomes this arena for intense epistemic struggles. Different claims to authority, different ways of defining what's real and who gets to say so are constantly battling it out.
Where do we see this clash most clearly? Maybe between Western science and, say, local religious beliefs.
Arabia provides some really potent examples. Think about the traveler H. St. John Philby. He was very much the modern scientific explorer, meticulous measurements, reliance on instruments, using things like the nautical almanac for precise navigation and prediction.
Yeah.
His authority came from empirical data.
Okay, so he represents Western scientific rationalism. Who or what did he clash with?
He clashed directly with the dominant Wahhabi doctrine in the regions he traveled. Their understanding of knowledge was rooted entirely in religious authority. They fundamentally rejected Philby's methods.
How so?
The Wahhabi view was that only God can know the hidden things, al-ghaib, like when rain will fall or what tomorrow holds. For them, Philby using his almanac wasn't just scientifically dubious, it was religiously forbidden. An impious attempt to uncover divine secrets that humans aren't meant to know.
So a direct conflict over what constitutes legitimate knowledge and where its boundaries lie. But the narrative themselves overwhelmingly seem to push the Western scientific view as superior, right? As universal.
Oh, they definitely assert that. Travelers constantly frame Western science, astronomy, geology, medicine as objective, universal truth. But the GWT analysis shows how thin that veneer of objectivity often was.
How do we see that?
Because these supposedly objective scientific accounts are just drenched in the traveler's own cultural biases and moral judgments. Science wasn't really objective. It was a tool used to validate existing hierarchies and assumptions about Western superiority.
That judgmental aspect seems even more pronounced when we look at the clash between a kind of commercial rationality and other value systems, like moral or missionary ones.
Yes, the commercial gaze is incredibly powerful in these texts. Entire nations, entire cultures were often evaluated almost purely on their economic efficiency and how quickly they adopted Western technology.
Japan comes up again here, I bet.
Japan was the poster child, praised constantly as progressive Japan because they embraced every new invention, from factories to telegraphs. Travelers literally celebrated Japan for replacing Confucius with figures like Galileo, Newton, Darwin, symbols of Western scientific and industrial thought.
And the flip side, cultures that stuck to traditional ways.
They were condemned. China, for example, with its long history of sophisticated artisanal production, using things like wheelbarrows, which were efficient in their context, was criticized for stolid self-conceit, for being stagnant, for failing to modernize according to the Western industrial playbook. Commercial utility became the yardstick for civilizational worth.
And this connects to how poverty was framed. You mentioned moral masking.
Right. When travelers encountered widespread poverty, say in India, which was a direct result of colonial economic policies and resource extraction, they rarely analyzed it structurally. Instead, they often attributed it to the moral failings of the natives themselves.
Calling them shiftless or lazy.
Exactly. Terms like shiftlessness appear frequently. It's a moral judgment that conveniently masks the economic rationalism of the system causing the poverty. By blaming the victim's character, the traveler, and by extension the empire, absolves themselves of responsibility.
So pluralism isn't just about acknowledging different truths exist. It's also about seeing how dominant systems actively suppress or delegitimize alternative knowledge.
Precisely. And a key mechanism for this was reclassification. Indigenous knowledge systems, especially spiritual ones, were often acknowledged, but only to be immediately denied ontological reality, denied the status of being really real.
Can you give an example of that? How they'd acknowledge but dismiss?
Think about indigenous beliefs about landscapes, like the Javanese view of volcanic mountains as the home of wicked spirits. Travelers might describe these beliefs, perhaps even express a kind of aesthetic awe at the dramatic idea. But they'd immediately frame it as myth, superstition, poetic fancy, not as a valid way of understanding the world. The belief is noted, but its truth value is nullified.
And sometimes useful knowledge was recognized, but then basically stolen and rebranded.
That's the appropriation piece. Quinine is the classic case. The knowledge that cinchona bark could treat malaria came directly from indigenous peoples in South America. But in the European narrative, this origin was systematically erased. The knowledge was absorbed, rebranded as Jesuits' bark, or later just part of Western medicine, and the original source was stripped of all credit and authority.
So the study uses pluralism to show that the archive isn't just a monument to a single dominant worldview. It actually contains the echoes, the traces of all the other ways of knowing it was trying to rank and suppress. Tag 3, becoming. Dynamic, evolving world.
Okay, the third dimension in this first cluster is becoming. GWT recognizes that the world isn't static. It's dynamic. It's always unfolding, always changing, always in process.
Change is constant. That seems straightforward enough, but how did the colonial travelers interpret this dynamism? Was it just neutral change?
No, definitely not neutral. And this is absolutely crucial for understanding their mindset. They interpreted becoming through the lens of what the study calls a moralized teleology.
Moralized teleology. Let's break that down. Teleology means moving towards a goal, an endpoint.
Exactly, a process directed towards a specific end. And the moralized part means they believe this endpoint, which for them was Western-style modernization, industrialization, Christian civilization, imperial order, wasn't just inevitable, it was inherently good, morally superior.
So any change moving towards that Western model was seen as positive progress, part of a destined righteous path.
Precisely. And this belief justified, in their minds, almost any action taken to accelerate that process, even if it involved violence, coercion, or destruction of existing ways of life.
Right.
If the endpoint is morally preordained as good, the means become secondary.
And technology was seen as the primary engine driving this destined becoming.
Technology was destiny in many ways. Progress was imagined almost entirely as a straight line moving towards Western technological adoption.
Japan again, I assume?
Japan was Exhibit A, hailed for its rapid adoption of every new invention, for swapping its traditional philosophy for Western science. Japan proved that this teleological path was the correct one, the successful one, even for non-Europeans if they fully committed to the Western model.
And the ultimate symbol of this inevitable technologically driven future.
The railway. Without a doubt, railroads were depicted not just as useful infrastructure, but as these almost mystical agents of inevitable transformation.
How so? What were railways supposed to do besides move things?
They were seen as a more potent change for a place like India than even Christian missions. Travelers wrote about how railways would dissolve ancient caste boundaries because everyone, high caste or low caste, had to cram into the same carriages. They reconfigured sacred geography by making distant pilgrimage sites easily accessible. The railway was literally remaking society in its image.
Even when it felt wrong, like building a railway line right up to Jerusalem, that must have felt jarring.
It was described as an incongruous modernism. There was a recognition of the clash with history, with sentiment, but ultimately practicality won. The train saved 3 hours of difficult travel compared to the traditional route, so sentiment had to give way to efficiency. Progress, defined as speed and utility, trumped reverence for the past. That's the logic of becoming in action.
And this logic wasn't just about technology. It was used to frame colonization itself as natural, even inevitable.
Yes, often using biological or religious metaphors. You see descriptions of Russian expansion, for instance, not as political aggression, but as the natural growth of a lusty young people. It's framed like a plant growing, inevitable and organic.
Or divine mandate.
Absolutely. The Anglo-Saxon race was frequently described as a providential race, implying they had a God-given duty, a destiny, to expand, dominate, and civilize the rest of the world. Expansion wasn't just conquest. It was fulfilling a preordained plan.
Which brings us back chillingly to that justification for the horror in Java. The Dutch culture system, 500,000 dead. How does becoming explain that justification?
It's the darkest side of moralized teleology. The argument, out of evil has come good, rests entirely on this idea of becoming. The immense suffering, the acknowledged evil, was framed as a necessary, albeit tragic, stage in the inevitable process of transforming Java into a productive, wealthy, for the Dutch, part of the modern world. The violence was embedded within the logic of progress itself.
It suggests that domination wasn't just a tool of progress, it was the engine of progress in their view.
That's a harsh but accurate reading of many of these texts.
Now, the study covers a period of about 40 years. Did the meaning of becoming, of progress, change at all over that time?
Yes. The study notes a subtle but significant shift. Early narratives, say from the 1880s, often emphasize grand spectacle, the sheer size and historical weight of things, like the pyramids. There's an awe for monumental grandeur.
And later on, towards the early 20th century.
Later, travelers start making different comparisons. They might contrast the pyramids, representing ancient, perhaps useless grandeur, with modern utilitarian achievements, things like hospitals, colleges, orphanages. Progress starts being defined less by impressive monuments and more by functional institutions, social welfare systems, controlled by the colonizers, of course.
So a shift from conquest and spectacle towards social engineering and administration as the marker of progress.
It seems that way. Perhaps a subtle attempt to re-justify empire based on providing order and welfare, rather than just raw power and historical destiny. a slight change in the definition of that good endpoint they were supposedly moving towards.
Okay, so part one gave us this picture of a world seen as interconnected, driven by competing truth systems, but ultimately heading towards one specific morally charged future. Now, in part two, we shift focus. It's less about what the world was seen to be and more about how the travelers actually produced the knowledge about that world.
All right, part two. We're looking now at how knowledge itself was made and who got to make it. The fourth GWT dimension is relational knowing. This builds on pluralism, arguing that all knowledge isn't just floating out there. It comes through relationships and it's always situated.
Situated knowledge.
Yeah.
The view from somewhere, right? Meaning who you are, where you are, your background, it all shapes what you see and understand.
Exactly. Your positionality matters. And because of this, the authority of the traveler wasn't just assumed. It had to be actively constructed within the narrative itself. They had to prove they had the right view.
How did they do that? Beyond just being European, I mean. What gave their observations weight in their own eyes and for their readers?
Often, it was about demonstrating risk, cunning, or privileged access. Captain Richard Burton is the classic example. He famously disguised himself as an Afghan physician to get inside Mecca, a city forbidden to non-Muslims.
He risked his life for that knowledge.
Precisely. The sheer danger involved, the elaborate deception, it conferred a kind of ultimate epistemic authority. He hadn't just seen Mecca, he had penetrated its secrets through disguise. This gave his account a weight no ordinary tourists could have.
Okay, that's the high adventure model. What about less dramatic travelers? How did they build authority?
Through claims of unique access or deeper immersion. The study mentions a couple, the Clarks. They emphasize how they were personally conducted by friends who lived in the places they visited. This wasn't just casual sightseeing. It supposedly gave them access to phases of life usually denied the hasty traveler. Homes, local customs, things off the main tourist track.
So being an insider by association, not just a passer through.
Right. And another common way was by emphasizing physical hardship. It sounds counterintuitive, maybe, but describing the discomfort proved you were really there, engaging authentically.
Like complaining about the bumpy ride.
Exactly. Descriptions of the terrifying speed of Javanese carriages or being bumped and shaken relentlessly in a sedan chair carried up a mountain. These details weren't just color. They served as evidence. They proved the traveler had endured the real experience, gone beyond the comfortable colonial bubble, and therefore earned the right to report authentically. Pain validated the observation.
But this idea of situated knowledge cuts both ways, doesn't it? Their positionality didn't just grant authority, it also created blind spots, filters, especially around class and economics.
Oh, massively. The traveler's default position was one of privilege. They traveled first class, they hired guides and servants, they expected locals to, as one text puts it, do our bidding. This inherent economic and social distance created a huge filter.
How did that filter affect what they saw or didn't see?
It often reduced the local population to mere background scenery, or primarily as a source of labor. Their lives, their perspectives, their own economic realities were obscured by the traveler's privileged viewpoint. And it directly influenced how they interpreted things like poverty.
Right, back to the shiftlessness argument.
Yes. Because they were observing from a position of relative wealth and security, they filtered the poverty they saw through their own class biases. Instead of seeing structural causes like land dispossession or exploitative wages imposed by the colonial system, they defaulted to moral explanations. The Hindu poor were described as the laziest class in the world due to inherent shiftlessness. Their privilege made the systemic causes invisible to them.
The study also mentions gender as another filter, another aspect of relational knowing. How did being a woman shape the traveler's perspective?
Sometimes women travelers explicitly claim their gender gave them different kinds of access. Mrs. Clark, mentioned earlier, argued she had more opportunities in some directions because she is a woman.
Access to what, specifically?
Often to the domestic sphere, to women's lives, family dynamics, subtle social interactions that male travelers, who might be more focused on politics, commerce, or exploration, could easily miss. It produced a different kind of knowledge, still situated, but valuable.
And religion, obviously, was a huge filter.
Absolutely. Christian travelers consistently used their faith as the default normative standard. When they encountered practices they didn't understand, like starving pilgrims refusing medicine from someone they considered an infidel.
They saw it as irrational superstition.
Exactly. They framed it as ignorant fanaticism, a failure of reason, rather than understanding it as a potentially profound expression of the pilgrims' own spiritual commitments, or even a form of resistance against the colonizers' worldview and authority. Their religious lens prevented them from seeing the other perspective.
So relational knowing really drives home that these narratives aren't objective mirrors. They're complex photographs taken from specific angles, through specific lenses of class, gender, religion, and the very act of traveling itself. #5. Entanglement, matter, mind, meaning.
Okay, next up is dimension 5, entanglement. This is a really core GWT concept. It argues that you fundamentally cannot separate the material world, matter, the world of thought and ideas, mind, and the world of symbols and significance, meaning. They are intrinsically tangled up together.
So it's not just that they influence each other, but that they are actually inseparable. Like you can't describe a physical place without also describing its meaning or the ideas associated with it.
Precisely. The material and the metaphysical are interwoven. Look at how travelers described landscapes.
They weren't just geological features.
Rarely just that. Think about volcanoes in Java, like Mount Bromo. The narratives describe it empirically, the geology, the raging, burning fire within. But in the very same breath, they engage with its symbolic meaning. They describe it as a place embodying divine power and wrath, or as the literal personification of baneful demons that the local Tangarese people tried to appease with sacrifices.
So the scientific observation and the spiritual interpretation exist side by side, entangled in the description.
Exactly. The mountain is simultaneously a geological fact and a moral or spiritual terrain. You can't untangle them in the narrative.
Does this entanglement apply to objects too? Like artifacts or resources?
Definitely. Material things carry this entanglement of history, labor, and meaning. The study uses the example of the diamond mines of Golconda in India.
Known for producing famous gems, but also notorious for cruelty.
Yes. The travel narratives record the history of these mines as a perpetual scene of horror. They talk about the brutal conditions, the forced labor, the suffering involved in extracting the diamonds. This history of violence wasn't seen as separate from the diamonds themselves.
It became part of the diamond's essence.
In a way, yes, especially with the most famous stone from there, the Kohinoor diamond. Its material brilliance, its economic value, became inseparable from the story of its extraction and its subsequent bloody history as it passed between rulers.
To the point where it was seen as cursed.
That's how the entanglement manifests. Narratives explicitly claim the Kohinoor carries a metaphysical curse, bringing misfortune and eventually destruction to its possessors. The physical object is literally burdened by its symbolic weight, its history of extraction and conflict. Matter, meaning, and history are completely bound together.
So empirical facts are constantly being fused with imaginative or symbolic interpretations. It's never just the facts.
Never just the facts. We saw this with climate science too, remember? Hittel's seemingly objective tables of temperature data for California
Were immediately used to make moral judgments about the superiority of the temperate zone.
Right. The empirical data, matter, was instantly entangled with a specific interpretation, mind, that carried huge political and ethical weight, meaning the climate wasn't just weather, it was moral destiny, proven by numbers.
Let's bring this down to the human level. How does entanglement show up in the descriptions of colonial labor, like the coolies carrying sedan chairs?
That's a powerful example of the entanglement of body, economy, and belief. The entire system of colonial travel in certain terrains depended materially on the physical bodies of these coolies.
Their muscles, their endurance.
Yes. The narratives describe the terribly hot work, the immense physical strain of carrying travelers up steep mountains for hours. The travelers' comfort, their ability to explore, mind meaning exploration, knowledge gathering, their participation in the colonial economy, matter, mobility, tourism, was directly materially dependent on the physical suffering embodied by the coolie matter body.
And the traveler's belief system likely justified this entanglement.
Often, yes. As we'll discuss more under ethical praxis, they developed justifications that it was honorable work, that the coolies were suited for it, that allowed them to participate in the system where their leisure was directly produced by another's physical hardship. The body of the laborer becomes this node where economy, physical reality, and ethical justification are all intensely tangled.
So entanglement forces us to see that in these narratives, nothing is simple. A mountain isn't just rock. A diamond isn't just carbon. Climate isn't just weather. And labor isn't just work. Everything is loaded with history, meaning, belief, and ethical consequence, all woven together. Hashtag text 6, contextuality, historical and ecological embeddedness.
Moving on to the sixth dimension, contextuality. This one emphasizes that meaning isn't universal or timeless. It's always shaped by its specific historical and ecological context. These travel narratives weren't written in a vacuum. They were products of their time and place.
So we need to understand the big forces shaping the world when these were written.
Exactly. The study argues these texts were produced largely as justifications for, or responses to, three massive global historical forces dominating that late 19th, early 20th century period.
Okay, what's the first one? I imagine imperialism is high on the list.
Number one, absolutely, imperialism. So many narratives functioned explicitly to justify colonial actions. You see arguments legitimizing the annexation of Oud in India or explaining why British intervention brought justice to Egypt.
And predicting the decline of rivals.
Yes, that too. There's a lot of dismissive language about other empires, especially the Ottoman Empire, often called a carcass, just waiting for European powers to carve it up. This kind of language normalized the idea of intervention and territorial expansion. The texts helped build the case for empire.
Okay, imperialism. What's the second major historical force?
Industrialization. The narratives are saturated with the logic of industrial progress. We've touched on this, but societies were constantly measured against the benchmark of Western technology. Did they have railroads, steamships, electric lights?
And if they didn't, or used traditional methods?
They were criticized. China's use of wheelbarrows wasn't seen as a culturally adapted, efficient system for their needs. It was framed as evidence of arrested development, a failure to embrace the inevitable march of industrial modernity. The travel narrative effectively becomes a progress report grading the world on its adoption of Western tech.
Makes sense. And the third force?
Missionary expansion. This provided the overarching moral and spiritual context for many travelers. Even non-missionary writers often adopted its framework.
How did that shape the narratives?
It provided a powerful lens for judging societies based on Christian values. It framed the entire colonial project as having a higher purpose, not just profit or power, but the spiritual salvation and civilizing of non-Western peoples. You see goals like transforming barbarous tribes of cannibals into an intelligent people, which casts intervention as a moral duty.
So imperialism, industrialization, missionary work, these big historical waves created the ocean these narratives swam in. But contextuality also looks at the local scale, right? Local ecology.
Yes, critically. It shows how the specific environment wasn't just a backdrop, but actively shaped culture and social life, often in ways that resisted those global forces.
Like the climate in Java.
Exactly. The intense tropical heat literally dictated daily routines. The need for an afternoon siesta, the architectural style of houses with wide verandas for shade. These weren't just quaint customs. They were necessary adaptations adopted even by European residents to simply function in that specific ecological context. Climate-shaped social rhythm.
And sometimes geography acted as a shield, protecting local cultures.
Right. The study points to the Tenggurese tribe in Java, living in those high, inaccessible volcanic mountains. Their geography made it difficult for outsiders, including the Dutch administration, to exert continuous control. This isolation allowed them to preserve their unique culture and religious practices for centuries, effectively buffered by the landscape itself. Ecology provided sanctuary.
And even specific plants could be deeply tied into the local context, linking ecology and spirituality.
Yeah, the example given is the frangipani flower. In Java and Malaysia, it's known as the flower of the dead, and plays an integral role in burial ceremonies and rituals. This shows how a particular element of the local flora becomes deeply woven into the community's spiritual cosmology. Meaning isn't just imported from global forces, it grows out of the specific ecological context.
Lastly, contextuality also tracks changes within the period. You mentioned a shift in the type of authority travelers claimed.
Yes, there's a noticeable shift from the late Victorian era towards the early 20th century. You move from figures like Burton, with his very dramatic, politically charged, almost heroic narrative style,
to figures like Philby.
Exactly. Philby represents a newer model. His emphasis is much more on scientific precision, mapping, collecting data, the kind of specialized expertise. It reflects a broader trend within the empire itself, the professionalization of knowledge. The swashbuckling adventurer is gradually being replaced by the specialist, the surveyor, the administrator. The context of knowledge production itself was changing.
Okay, so part two showed us knowledge is situated, tangled up with meaning and matter, and deeply embedded in both global history and local ecology. Now, part three seems to shift gears again, looking at moments of critique, uncertainty, and the ethical dimensions. Where does the GWT framework take us next?
Right. Part 3 focuses on critique and what we might call future worlding, how these texts might point beyond themselves. We start with Dimension 7, Nonfinality. This is the GWT idea that knowledge, theories, understanding, they're never finished. They're always open-ended, always incomplete.
So even though these colonial narratives often sound incredibly confident, almost arrogant, non-finality looks for the cracks, the moments where that certainty breaks down.
Exactly. It searches the archive for questions, uncertainties, moments where the traveler has to admit they don't know or where their framework fails them, and these moments are surprisingly common.
Where do we see the limits of their prized Western science showing up?
Even someone as rigorously scientific as Philby runs into limits. He notes, with some frustration, that he simply cannot scientifically verify or disprove the Bedouin belief that certain stones in the desert move by themselves. It's outside his framework.
He just has to leave it as an unknown.
He does, and he also expresses real anxiety about his own medical knowledge. He admits he only has the commonest pills or tabloids and feels uneasy treating complex illnesses, recognizing the profound limitations of his Western medicine in that specific remote context. Science hits a wall.
And history itself could be resistant, refusing to fit neatly into their understanding.
Definitely. There were historical puzzles they couldn't solve. The Mayan glyphs, for instance, remained undeciphered, a visible testament to a complex past that resisted Western interpretation. Or ancient structures like the Borobudur Temple in Java Travelers describe being left in bewildered astonishment, admitting its true purpose and meaning still remains a matter of conjecture. The past wasn't always easily assimilated.
So limits to science, limits to historical understanding. But maybe the most interesting examples of non-finality are the internal contradictions. The moments where the colonial worldview itself seems to stumble over its own inconsistencies.
Yes, those unresolved tensions are very revealing. We talked about the railway to Jerusalem, the clash between practical utility saving time and pious sentiment,
Right.
respecting the historical route. The narrative might choose utility, but it records the tension, the sense of loss, the feeling that something valuable is being sacrificed for efficiency. The choice is made, but the contradiction isn't resolved.
And there are moments of, you called it ethical schizophrenia, where their judgments about civilized versus savage get completely scrambled.
That's a key site of non-finality. A traveler might describe, say, the profound generosity and dignity of an indigenous Mayan woman calling her people a race of heroes, and then immediately contrast that virtue with the cheating and avarice of a snub-nosed rogue shopkeeper in Yucatecan town, someone presumably considered more civilized.
So the person labeled primitive acts more virtuously than the one labeled civilized.
Exactly. It creates this cognitive dissonance, this crack in the neat hierarchy they're trying to impose. The narrative records behavior that fundamentally contradicts the supposed moral superiority of the civilized world, leaving the contradiction hanging.
And perhaps the ultimate symbol of this non-finality, this sense that the colonial worldview isn't the final word, is the persistence of other spiritual realities.
I think so. The image of the ancient Buddhist statues in temples, described as remaining calm and inscrutable, utterly unharmed by many centuries of neglect, and seemingly indifferent to the noisy, modernizing world the travelers represent, is powerful. Their silent, enduring presence acts as a constant, passive rebuke to the idea that the Western way, the path of becoming, is the only or ultimate reality. They represent a profound, non-Western truth that simply persists unassimilated. ####8. Ethical praxis. World description as world creation. Following non-finality, we get to ethical praxis, the eighth dimension. This brings us back to that core idea. Descriptions of the world aren't neutral acts. They have real ethical weight, real consequences. To describe the world is to participate in its creation, and that is fundamentally an ethical act.
So how we talk about things matters, morally. And in these colonial narratives, that ethical performance was overwhelmingly aimed at what?
Primarily at justifying domination. The narratives consistently perform the ethical labor needed to legitimize empire. They do this by selectively highlighting certain things, like the alleged misrule of the Turkish government before annexation, or the supposed moral failings like shiftlessness among the poor, to build a case that intervention or subjugation is actually morally necessary, even beneficial.
So description becomes the ethical groundwork for political action. But the travelers themselves, being in these situations, must have faced ethical dilemmas, moments where their own complicity was unavoidable.
Absolutely. Their position was often deeply fraught. Take the use of porters or coolies for transport. The travelers were directly benefiting from labor performed under conditions of obvious physical hardship, sometimes coercion.
How did they deal with that ethically in their writing?
They rationalized. They developed justifications. A common one was to argue that being a porter was an honorable and reputable way of earning a living for the locals. This framing minimizes the exploitation, normalizes the inequality, and allows the traveler to consume the labor with a clearer conscience. It's an ethical workaround.
And what about encountering extreme poverty? Beggars. How did they ethically navigate that constant presence of suffering?
Often by creating moral distance. Travelers wrote about having to steel our hearts against beggars. The common rationalization was to claim that most were misery vendors, just imposters faking their suffering, or that giving charity would only encourage laziness and dependence.
So, by questioning the moral integrity of the poor, they could sidestep their own ethical obligation to help?
Exactly. It creates a moral loophole. If the suffering isn't genuine, or if helping would be bad for them, then the traveler is absolved of responsibility for the poverty generated by the very system they represent.
Amidst all this justification and distancing, the study highlights Lady Burton as offering a different kind of ethical praxis, almost a counter-narrative.
Yes, Isabel Burton, Captain Burton's wife, stands out. Her ethical lens was unusually wide for the time. She expressed a strong belief that animals suffer the same as we do, only they can't speak. This wasn't just sentiment. She actively tried to establish animal welfare organizations in places like Trieste and Cairo to combat cruelty, particularly towards working animals like horses and donkeys.
That feels quite radical for the era, extending serious moral concern beyond human.
It was. And what's perhaps even more striking is how she applied this ethical critique to the bastion of Western authority, science itself.
How so?
She vehemently condemned vivisection, the practice of experimenting on live animals, which was growing in scientific circles. She didn't just disagree with it, she denounced it passionately as a luth of cruelty that was being justified under the plea of science. Just as, she argued, the horrors of the Inquisition had once been justified under the plea of religion.
Wow, that's a direct attack on the moral authority of science, comparing it to religious persecution.
It's incredibly powerful. It shows an internal critique coming from within the imperial milieu, challenging the ethical basis of one of its core pillars. Lady Burton's writings exemplify ethical praxis because her descriptions weren't just observations. They were moral arguments demanding change, challenging the status quo, even when that status quo claims scientific legitimacy. ###99. Transversality, cross-domain knowledge. And that brings us to the ninth and final GWT dimension, transversality. This idea argues that the most profound insights often don't come from staying within one field of knowledge, one discipline. They emerge at the intersections by crossing boundaries between different domains.
So thinking across silos, basically, connecting the dots between different ways of knowing.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is, these colonial travelers, perhaps unintentionally, were often practicing a kind of transversality. Because they were trying to create a total picture of the places they visited, they naturally had to integrate different kinds of knowledge.
They weren't just geographers or economists or anthropologists. They were trying to be all of them at once.
In a way, yes. To make sense of what they saw, they had to connect, say, climate, morality, and economics. Remember Hittel and his temperature charts?
Used to argue for the political and cultural superiority of the temperate zone.
Right. The insight, or rather the justification, only emerges when you read the scientific climate data, science matter, through the lens of a moral hierarchy, ethics meaning, to reach a conclusion about political destiny and economic potential, politics economics. It requires crossing those domains.
Or connecting geology, faith, and commerce when talking about something like diamonds.
Perfect example. You have the geological reports about diamond strata, that's science and potential commerce. Then you have Lady Burton's interpretation of the Code-Knower's curse, that's faith and metaphysical meaning. And underlying it all is the history of extraction and trade, economics, and politics. The full story of the diamond only makes sense when you see how these different domains intersect and create tension.
The study suggests the whole data set kind of models this, a structure of science filtered through literature, then judged by ethics.
That's a key takeaway about the form of these narratives. They often present scientific or empirical observations, science, but they make them compelling and relatable through narrative techniques, storytelling, aesthetic description, literature. And then, this literary rendering becomes the basis for making moral judgments, evaluations, and justifications. ethics.
So knowledge generation itself was a transversal process.
Yes, you needed that integration to create the comprehensive, persuasive world picture they were aiming for. They couldn't explain what they saw as, say, China's arrested development using only one lens.
How did they connect the dots there?
They linked ethnography, their observations about Chinese culture, particularly the adherence to Confucian tradition, directly to economics. What they saw as a failure to modernize factories, adopt steam power, and compete effectively in the global market. The perceived cultural traits, ethnography mind, were presented as the direct cause of the economic outcome. Economics matter. It took crossing those domains to build the explanation.
So transversality really reinforces that GWT view of entanglement. You can't understand geography without economics, or labor without morality, or culture without technology. The world picture they built was necessarily a composite woven together from all these intersecting threads. Hashtag synthesis and conclusion.
Okay, so we've walked through all 9 dimensions of GWT as applied to this massive colonial archive.
Yeah.
Interdependence, pluralism, becoming, relational knowing, entanglement, contextuality, nonfinality, ethical praxis, and transversality. Bringing it all together, what's the big picture, the synthesis?
Well, it comes back to that powerful, maybe uncomfortable conclusion the study started with. Description is creation. These narratives, all 3,200 pages of them, weren't just reflecting a pre-existing world. They were actively constructing the categories we still use, categories of geography, race, labor, civilization, progress.
And these categories were built specifically to justify a global system based on hierarchy, extraction, and exploitation. The words built the intellectual and moral scaffolding for empire.
But importantly, the analysis also shows it wasn't a monolithic process. The archive itself contains the contradictions, the suppressed voices, the ethical doubts, the moments where the system didn't quite hold together. It preserves traces of resistance and other ways of being, even while trying to overwrite them.
That complexity is key. It wasn't simple. And the study's method is also part of the story here, pointing towards the future, this idea of augmented hermeneutics.
Right, where human scholars used AI tools, large language models like NotebookLM and Claude, to help them navigate and analyze this enormous amount of text.
It's a practical demonstration of GWT principles, actually. Knowledge creation as relational, entangled in this case between human interpretive skills and machine processing power. It suggests a new way of doing deep, qualitative research at scale.
So stepping back from the study itself, what's the final takeaway for us listening to this now? Why does digging through these old travel narratives matter today?
The study forces us to confront the fact that we've inherited the epistemic architecture of that era. The categories, the assumptions, the narrative structures we just spent time unpacking, they didn't just disappear in 1922.
You mean the way we link climate change to development, or technology to progress, or poverty to individual failings? Those ways of thinking have roots in this colonial archive.
Deep roots. When we talk today about global supply chains or artificial intelligence ethics or migration crises, we are often, unconsciously perhaps, still operating within the grammars, the ways of framing the world that were solidified during this period. We still wrestle with that tension between scientific utility and ethical responsibility, for example.
So the final provocative thought, the worlding now imperative, as the outline called it, is about our own role in this.
Exactly. The question becomes, how are our descriptions today, in the news, in policy documents, in academic work, even in everyday conversations? How are our descriptions of climate change, of technology, of global inequality, shaping the world we live in right now? What futures are our words enabling, and which ones are they closing off?
We're all still worlding. We can't escape describing the world and therefore participating in its creation.
We can't. The lesson from this deep dive into the colonial past isn't just historical, it's a call for radical responsibility in the present. We need to be incredibly critical and conscious of the way we describe our world because those descriptions have power.
The goal isn't to stop worlding, but maybe to do it more consciously, more relationally, more plurally, more ethically, as GWT suggests.
That's the challenge, recognizing that the world isn't just a thing out there to be discovered, but something we are constantly co-creating through our language and our actions. The responsibility is immense, and it lies fundamentally in how we choose to see, and crucially, how we choose to speak about the entangled world we all inhabit.